Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Why are there popesplainers? What is the psychological or philosophical disposition behind the various apologetic individuals out there who, no matter what Pope Francis does, they can find a way to spin it into something positive when we all know that it's bad? Why do they do that? We're going to discuss that. I stuttered. Stay tuned. So there is this phenomenon in Catholic apologetics, largely online, which is where most of it takes place today, through things like podcasts, where there has arisen this type of thing called a popesplainer. And what is this person about? Well, basically, there's almost nothing that Pope Francis can say or do that they won't defend in some way. That doesn't mean there aren't limits. When Pope Francis released his statement saying all religions are paths to God, for example, some of the more notable popesplainers weren't willing to defend that, although some of them were. But basically and that statement was in an interview type of thing, but basically everything that is presented on a piece of paper with Pope Francis's signature on it, whether he wrote it or not, like, for example, Fiducia Supplicans, which was blessings for gay unions, which was clearly bad. Everything that's presented as some sort of doctrinal statement of Pope Francis, they'll find a way to make it that it must be good. It's kind of like there's an expression where, you can't put lipstick on a pig kind of thing, but they'll still attempt to do that. Why do they do that? Well, we can only guess. But there are certain things that try to help us make sense of it. And I want to discuss those real quickly with you. In the first place, I'm trying to think of a popesplainer who isn't a convert to Catholicism. Now, this does not mean that all converts to Catholicism are popesplainers at all. And in fact, some of the best commentators in Catholic tradition have been converts. I believe Michael Davies himself was a convert. Of course, he's passed, but that's just one example. But in general, when we look at the Catholic apologetics intelligentsia, the most famous ones, the most well-known ones, virtually all of them are converts. Many of them come from ministry backgrounds. This is interesting because when you look at the reasons why, especially a lot of Protestants convert to Catholicism, it really hinges on the notion of the Pope and also the real presence of the Christ in the Eucharist and, of course, the Virgin Mary. The thing about the second two, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and the Virgin Mary, these are matters of faith, and they're a matter of belief in the sense that they can accept these beliefs, and they're just simply what you believe as part of the faith, and when it makes sense, they believe it. The papacy is like that as well, accepting the papacy. Is there a papacy? Has there historically been a papacy? And so on and so forth. And once they assent to that, now they're faced with a different kind of problem. Because when you read about the papacy in the ancient works, in the apologetics and stuff, it makes the papacy sound pretty great, doesn't it? But then when you encounter the statements of post-conciliar popes, you find a lot of things that make you scratch your head. So you're kind of faced with this problem. And I think that gives us insight into why a lot of these convert apologists would be willing to bend over backwards and do mental gymnastics to try to defend Pope Francis, even when what he says is indefensible. Because if you've basically burned all your Protestant bridges, you left a career in ministry, you have had to put up with family life problems and so forth because everyone else is a Protestant but you've made radical changes, and you've converted to the Catholic faith, obviously because of grace, but also because of the fact that you've studied the matter and you've become convinced of things, it presents a major challenge, even a type of anxiety, to have to admit that the Pope who holds the office presently isn't, isn't meeting the expectations, isn't living up to the expectations of that Platonic form of the papacy that you assented to when you were convinced that Catholicism was true. So you're kind of faced with a problem, because do you admit that this Pope and previous popes have done some bad stuff and said crazy things? Or do you find a way to explain it all away so that you can hold the Pope to a standard that this particular man doesn't reach? You know, a lot of these men who have converted and become apologists, which is the majority, to be honest, at this point, and again, not all of them fit this bill. There are many converts from Protestantism that aren't popesplainers. One of the more well-known Catholic authors who is a convert but doesn't do the whole popesplaining thing would be a friend of mine, Eric Sammons, editor of Crisis Magazine. But many of the ones that are converts and are major apologists in all the major organizations, they're all converts from Protestantism, and they all defend Pope Francis's statements in ways that are basically comical at this point. They face a challenge because what will happen to their faith if the Pope actually turns out to be bad, considering they've read their way into the church by coming to an intellectual position that says, yeah, the papacy's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I think that's one of the reasons. And that also follows with the secondary phenomenon that you see. It's not only a defense of that, but you see an attack on Catholics who don't hold those same sort of popesplainer views. So you see a lot of these apologists going after traditionalists like myself, Tiller Marshall, and so forth. And why would they do that? I mean, it seems very strange for someone who's trying to defend the Catholic faith to go after other Catholics who just believe something different about a disputed question. And often they get pretty nasty and they resort to things like slander and misrepresentation and so forth. And it's not just the little rinky-dink YouTubers, but some of the big names have done the same thing, and I've been on the receiving end of it in really immoral ways. Why do they do that? Well, because in the mind of someone who has this difficulty of separating the faults of a man from the perfections of an office, by pointing out the faults with the particular occupant of the papacy, in their mind, you're basically attacking their faith. So if you say, yeah, Pope Francis uttered heresy when he said all paths lead to God, which he did, well, now you're basically invalidating the reason they became Catholic. You're attacking their faith, and they have to attack you. But here's the thing. And we can all be guilty of this, of course, but we are Catholics because Catholicism is true, not because we overemphasize one particular aspect of the faith. So we can handle criticism and we don't have to attack people. We should respond to things if we can, but we don't have to go on the offensive all the time. But these popesplainers, they just go after traditional Catholics mercilessly in ways that are often very immoral, because their faith rests on shaky ground, it seems. If there's something wrong with the Pope, then did they make the biggest mistake of their life? There are also often career problems that would face them. Many of these men who have converted from Protestantism went right into Catholic apologetics, which was so irresponsible for those who hired them to do so. You shouldn't be putting people in positions to basically do apologetics for the faith when they've just recently come into the church. I understand testimonies and things like that. They're inspirational, but anyway. So Not only are you attacking their misguided energies that they've put into trying to make their faith about one person or one concept, you're also basically going after their pocketbook, which is a big deal. And I think for a lot of these men, they can't sleep well at night if there's something wrong with the Pope. I don't know if they have an ability to conceive of that being possible. And I think that causes them a lot of fear. And I think that's why they have decently large followings from a lot of younger men who need them as sort of these spiritual gurus, these apologetical gurus to decode the statements of Pope Francis to make sure that everything's fine. And you'll also find that these young men are often going after other Catholics relentlessly on social media and things like that in ways that are really irrational, where no logical conversation is possible. They just start throwing out words like schismatic and Pharisee or whatever. That's a super common phenomenon. And it's really unhistorical, this position. You know, when I was in Italy last year and I lived there as a youngster, in these traditionally, historically Catholic places, none of this popesplaining stuff historically is going to fly. They're too Catholic, and they've been Catholic for too long, for too many thousands of years, and they've been through too many popes to turn the Pope into an archetype of Christ, into a Superman. Just look at church history in the Middle Ages and various other times, and look at how prelates, theologians, statesmen, the average person would talk about the Pope. I'm not saying it was always good, but the point is that they have this eternal perspective where, heck, the Pope has been here as long as the aqueducts, and they're still standing. We'll weather storms, and we don't have to make it all about this person, even if the office is obviously, extremely important to the Catholic faith as a whole. And for a lot of these, American Catholic apologists who are converts from Protestantism, constantly going after other Catholics who tell the truth about what Pope Francis said, I think that they demonstrate in some ways, when Christ talks about the seeds of faith being sown into rocky ground or into sandy ground, and it can be washed away with a storm, they just don't have roots that are long enough in order to withstand it, because they've planted it in this very superficial soil. Whereas these historical Catholic cultures, they've seen popes rise and fall, and they kind of understand that's just part of the game, even if the popes are almost always pretty good, historically. Last thing I'll say is, again, this has nothing to do with all converts. Many converts don't fall into popesplaining. But it's an interesting phenomenon to see that pretty much all the popesplaining apologists, all of them that I can think of that go after other Catholics, they're all converts from Protestantism. Some of them have switched religions a dozen times. And you can see that there's this very irrational hatred or resentment they have for other Catholics by the way they act, because it's almost as if they feel personally attacked when somebody tells the obvious truth that Pope Francis or other post-conciliar popes have said things that are bad. And it's a shame, because that sort of faith is not sustainable. And my prediction is that over the next while, you'll probably see some of these men leave the church, if I'm being honest, because there's just no peace of soul in that position. And it's untenable, ultimately. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have for you today. Just a short video. This has been Mere Tradition, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.